canceled a security exercise, a joint security exercise with the government of Uganda, because Uganda has a new anti-gay law, a new anti-homosexual law. And yet we are continuing to give $400 million of aid to the Palestinian Authority, which just kidnapped 3 Jewish kids, including an American citizen, and routinely hangs gay people. We are signing peace deals with the Iranians, who hang gay people from cranes. The hypocrisy of this administration is beyond belief. They'll make PR moves when they feel that it's necessary to do so, but they never actually do enough to help anybody. All they are crafting is a chaotic world. Well, with all of this chaos emerging in Iraq, one commentator is now speaking out about what he sees as the rise of a new chaotic world in the aftermath of the Obama administration. Powerful piece. We'll get to it. Ben Shapiro Show, AM 770, KTTH, KTTH.com. Victor Davis Hanson is a professor at the Hoover Institution. He's written a really powerful column today talking about what exactly has happened in the world since the Obama administration took over. He writes, amid all the talk of the isolationism that supposedly characterizes the Obama administration's foreign policy, we forget that since World War II, the global order has largely been determined by U.S. engagement. The historically rare state of prosperity and peace that defined the post-war world were due to U.S. vigilance and sacrifice. Germany in the last 150 years has been at the center of 3 European wars, winning one, losing another, and destroying much of Europe and itself in the third. Yet present-day Germany has the largest economy in Europe and the 4th largest in the world. For 70 years, Germany, even after its second historic unification in 1989, has not translated such economic preeminence into military power, much less aggression. In fact, the strategic status quo of post-war Europe remains mostly unquestioned. That strange fact is due almost entirely to the U.S.-led NATO determination to protect the eastern flank of Europe from potential enemies, to reassure Germany that it need not rearm, and to quietly support the European nuclear monopolies of Britain and France. While the U.S. has always talked up the American-inspired United Nations, its first allegiance has always been to assure liberal democratic states in Europe of unshakable American support. Any weakening of the latter might send Europe back into the tumultuous 20th century. A similar paradox exists in Asia. Pakistan and North Korea are 2 of the weakest economies and most unstable political systems in the region. Yet both nations are nuclear, despite rather than because of U.S.-led efforts at non-proliferation. In comparison, by any logical measure, far wealthier and more sophisticated states like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and perhaps the Philippines should all be nuclear. Yet none have. That fact, too, is largely because of American security guarantees. Why, then, has the Obama administration sought to negotiate nuclear arms reduction agreements solely with the Russians? The latter has no responsibilities resembling the host of American dependents. Economically successful but non-nuclear Asian nations claim a portion of the U.S. deterrent force as critical to their own survival. Any failure to reassure Asian and Pacific partners that our own nuclear forces are pledged to their survival would lead to a sizable increase in the world's nuclear family. In addition to protecting post-war Europe and the Pacific, writes Victor Davis Hanson today, the United States has traditionally sided with historically persecuted and vulnerable peoples who, in the calculations of realpolitik, might not otherwise warrant such staunch friendship. U.S. security guarantees to Israel, a mere 7 million people, until recently without oil reserves and surrounded by a host of more numerous and oil-wealthy enemies, have for a half-century assured the viability of the Jewish state. For all the present acrimony over the Iraq War, we forget that one dividend was the emergence of a semi-autonomous and largely constitutional Kurdistan of some 7 million people, whose recent tragic history has been one of ethnic cleansing, gassing, and slaughter. Only prior liberation by and current support from America keep viable the small, landlocked province. He points out this is also true of Taiwan. He points out that this is true to Greece. He says that when you look at this attempt to downsize America's influence in the world, it's such a disaster area. We're ending a period of order and prosperity in favor of an era of uncertainty and chaos. For all the grand talk of working with the United Nations, writes Professor Hanson, the Obama administration ignored it in Syria, vastly exceeded its no-fly zone and humanitarian aid resolutions in Libya, and misled it when it asserted to the General Assembly that a videomaker had prompted violence against U.S. facilities in Benghazi. The Obama administration's reset with Russia paid no attention to our Eastern European friends. Meanwhile, China is angry and confused that the U.S. suddenly wants it to behave in the Pacific after turning a blind eye for 5 years as it bullied most of its neighbors. After assembling a coalition to beef up sanctions against Iran, the U.S. eased them to begin new negotiations with the theocracy without consultation with our allies. And, of course, no one in Latin America knows what, to any degree, the U.S. opposes the creeping spread of authoritarian Marxist governments. The Obama administration, meanwhile, declares that climate change is the chief global threat. That new inanimate target is welcome news to aggressive nations that had once feared that their own reckless behavior might have been so singled out. Americans did not fully appreciate the costly post-war global order that the United States had established over the last 70 years. Maybe they will start to as they witness advantage. Depressing stuff from Victor Davis Hanson. But this really comes down to a certain vision of the universe, a certain vision of how the world works. President Obama, his Democratic allies, that party has been hijacked by the hard left. A hard left that believes that America has largely been a force for bad in the world. A group of people who believe that America is a nasty place that has engaged in nation building and nation destroying, that has destroyed American credibility by intervention in other countries. That forgets the situation on the ground. It ignores the situation on the ground. The real situation on the ground is that every place where the United States has touched a boot and stayed is a better place because of it. That is virtually without exception. This attempt to deride what America has accomplished in the world over the last 100 years is so foolhardy. Now, I know that we are now exiting the living memory of World War II. That very few people remember World War I. But we all have history books. We all have Wikipedia. We can all look up the pictures of how the world worked in the first half of the 20th century, when America was one of a couple superpowers, when America was isolationist in nature. And then we can look at what happened in the second half of the century, the supposed bloody presence of the United States. America in World War II lost 200,000 men. The rest of the century, we did not even come close in aggregate to that number. In the places where we stayed, we prevented mass slaughter, and we built prosperous nations, trading partners, countries that ended up being our allies. And the Obama administration's idea is to throw that over, to dump that over in favor of a weaker America abroad and a more redistributionist America at home. That's not a vision. That's a devolvement. That's not a vision for America. It's a dissolution of what it means to be American. It was the founders who called America an empire of liberty, who suggested that as we grew, as we became more powerful, as we took advantage of our manpower and our resources and our intellectual capital, we would become the player, the great player on the global stage. The founders, contrary to popular opinion, were not isolationists. In fact, a huge percentage of our budget was devoted to national defense. They were deeply involved in international incidents. But our founders understood one thing. If we were going to move forward, if we were going to involve ourselves in the world, it requires an America that is unashamed of what it is. We cannot be in a position as Americans where we're now in the worst possible situations. We throw troops into unwinnable situations. Why bother paying a standing army of millions of people if we're going to throw them into unwinnable situations and then pull them out at the first sign of victory? It's time for us to get a grip. America is not only a wonderful place, it is a force for good in the world. And not only that, if you want it to be a greater force for good in the world, perhaps we ought to look to the people who have made that possible, the U.S. military, instead of gutting the military and relying on some of the worst people on planet Earth to suddenly turn nice. As we continue here on the Ben Shapiro Show, a couple of major primaries happening yesterday across the nation, one exposing a pretty vast rift between the establishment Republican Party and the Tea Party. Our number, 800-465-8770, 800-465-8770. This is the Ben Shapiro Show, AM 770, KTTH, KTTH.com. Man, I'm not sure that I have ever been more upset about the establishment Republican Party than I am today. Not because I think Thad Cochran is the world's worst guy in the Republican primary over in Mississippi, but because I'm just disgusted at how he won his seat. For those who weren't following this particular race, there was a big Senate race in which a Tea Party challenger named Chris McDaniel was taking on an incumbent senator named Thad Cochran. Thad Cochran is 76 years old. He is a crony capitalist to the bone. He focuses on bringing pork home to his district. He is pro-amnesty. He's one of the, quote-unquote, most moderate members of the Republican caucus in the Senate. He's kind of a good old boy when it comes to working with folks on the other side of the aisle, which, of course, is not something that strikes the fancy of too many folks in the Tea Party. Well, he was losing his primary pretty dramatically to Chris McDaniel, which was a shocker for a lot of folks. Yesterday, he won his primary against Chris McDaniel, and he did so by basically using a bunch of really horrifying Democrat tactics. According to the New York Times, with an unusual assist from African-American voters and other Democrats who feared his opponent, Senator Thad Cochran on Tuesday beat back a spirited challenge from State Senator Chris McDaniel, triumphing in a Republican runoff and defeating the Tea Party in the state where the movement's hopes were bright. "We have a right to be proud of our state tonight," said Cochran. "This is your victory." McDaniel was pretty pissed, and he had a right to be, given the fact that basically Cochran went out there and said to a bunch of Democrat black voters who will never vote for him in a general election that Chris McDaniels was a giant racist. There's a flyer that was going around Mississippi, heavily in black precincts. This flyer says, quote, "The Tea Party intends to prevent blacks from voting on Tuesday." Now, if you thought that Eric Holder had put that out or Barack Obama, you'd be wrong. It was allies of Thad Cochran, the Republican senator from Mississippi, targeting the Tea Party and claiming that they were a bunch of racists. Quote, "According to the Clarion Ledger, Chris McDaniel and the Tea Party plan to prevent Democrats voting in the Senate runoff on Tuesday between Thad Cochran and the Tea Party candidate Chris McDaniel. We know the Tea Party uses Democrats as code for African Americans." This is how Thad Cochran won. He scared a bunch of black folks into believing that if Chris McDaniel won, some giant white racist horror monger had won, and now they had to, and so he had to be defeated. That's pretty cheap stuff. And this is not a rumor. This is pretty well known. Dana Bash is a reporter for CNN. She said, look, without the support of leftist blacks in Mississippi, Thad Cochran gets defeated by Tea Party candidate Chris McDaniel.
Another thing that I will point out, and just in all candor, the Cochran people here are saying that if this was just a truly Republican race, if the law here in Mississippi did not allow Democrats to vote, then he probably, almost certainly, would be losing to Chris McDaniel.
Well, McDaniel was fighting mad, as he had a right to be. In his speech, he said, we're going to continue fighting.
There is something a bit strange. There is something a bit unusual